Thank you, Joanna. And in fact, I suspect I'm even going to be a tad nervous tonight, which is rather odd. So I'll settle down. But probably the nerves is related to the fact that, contrary to the lectures I always give, or normally give, as students would know, for better or for worse, I don't use notes. Whereas tonight, given this is my so-called farewell lecture, which it isn't really, I still have about another 2 or 3 to go, and in one form or t'other I'll be floating around COFA, although not teaching until April next year. But I did think, for the sake of this final presentation, as it were, it would make sense to stick to a script and to do my best to keep it within about 2 hours, plus or minus. Not that long. Okay. Just at the beginning, I'd like to dedicate this lecture to Nick Waterlow. Nick was a very, very dear friend of mine, a very close friend, and a very dear and wonderful colleague. So this is dedicated to Nick wherever he and his wonderful daughter Chloe might be. Synchronicity is a wonderful thing, and if you happen to Google, look at Google and play around with it yesterday, and you visited its homepage, you would have discovered that Google yesterday was in fact celebrating the life and legacy of the great modernist author Catherine Mansfield, who died on October the 14th, or was born October the 14th, 1888. And as some of you might know, she lived and based many of her texts on her where she was born in New Zealand. And she wrote simply under the pen name of Catherine Mansfield. So you might wonder, why am I mentioning Catherine Mansfield right at the beginning of this lecture? I just thought it might be worthwhile to dig around a bit more. I mean, I was aware of her book, The Garden Party, from 1922, but I played around and dug around and sought out things. And I came across this letter she wrote in 1921, to the British artist Dorothy Brett. And she said, and I quote, this is Catherine Mansfield, "I am deeply interested in what you feel about Manet. For years he has meant more to me than any other of those French painters. He satisfies something deep in me." He satisfies something deep in me. So tonight, of course, we are looking at Manet. And in this sense, I'm returning to really my first passion. As a student, I did my PhD on Manet at Bristol University, and I've lectured countless times on Manet, although, as many of you would know, some of my more recent books have certainly not been on Manet. They've been on such things as fire and barbed wire. And the next book is actually on feet. So Manet has been relegated a tad. In 1883, shortly before his death, he was awarded the prestigious Légion d'honneur from the French government. And this, I would add, for an artist who, on more than one occasion, had ruffled, to put it mildly, the Parisian art world. But then, as we know, being bad is not all that bad. So tonight I'm focusing on a single painting by Manet, the work you see here. And this also reflects a long-standing passion, and again, people who I've taught would know this, and certainly people doing my current course, The Painting of Modern Life, French and British Painting in the mid-late 19th century. I think it's very important to look very closely at images. The closer, the better. So I'm focusing on one painting. but also looking at it in terms of how it looks, as it were, both back and forward in Manet's odd practice. And to be sure, it's a very odd practice. So it's Chez le Père Lathuile, the work we see here, with the subtitle Manet himself added, En plein air, out of doors. Now this en plein air, as we'll see later on, I think is more than a tad important. I think titles with Manet are very important. I think titles per se are very important. But very often it's omitted in the identification of this painting. Chez le Père Lathuile, surprisingly, I think, has received very little scholarly attention. In the Great Manet retrospective held in Paris, New York, way back in 1983, which I was fortunate to see, it simply wasn't included. More recently, and I could cite many examples, but take Carol Armstrong's 2002 book, Manet, which I think offers an intriguing study of the feminine other, as it were, and also consumerism in the art of Manet. This painting only gets a few paragraphs. According to media releases, this painting was to be in the recent Manet portrait exhibition, portraying life exhibition at the Royal Academy, London. And indeed, this was one of the reasons I went to London early this year, and also to give a lecture at my alma mater, Bristol University. Alas, the painting wasn't there. I still don't know why, but the fascinating thing was that lots of critics spoke about it, as if it was indeed there. So I'm going to refer to this work henceforth as Le Père. It was first shown in 1880 at the Paris Salon that year. And it was shown together with the work we see here, the portrait of Proust, Antonin Proust, who would go on to become Manet's first somewhat partisan biographer, although all biographers are partisan. And in this work here, Manet shows his good friend, Proust, very much as the elegant boulevardier. He's got frock, coat, top hat, gloves, cane, in ways I think that bring very much to mind this wonderful portrait by Fontaine Latour of Manet himself that was exhibited in 1867 in the Salon by Latour, the very same year that Manet had bypassed the Salon, which was a major exhibiting venue in Paris in the 19th century. Manet in 1967 had bypassed the Salon and organized his own one-person show. So if you can imagine this in the exhibition, I think it's a very nice bit of publicity, as it were, presenting as it does, and as it did, the very antithesis of the dirty, vulgar, bohemian, disheveled, realist artist, quote unquote, that many people felt Manet and certainly Courbet to be. So what does a preliminary reading of Le Père suggest? Well, firstly, it's obviously a painting about Parisian leisure. More precisely, urban leisure, as it were, but one referencing a domesticated nature. We are looking at the garden terrace of the popular cafe restaurant Père Lathuile in the so-called Batignolles quarter of Paris at number 7 Rue de Clichy. And if you have a look at Rue de Clichy today, you can see where Père Lathuile was. Today the site, perhaps appropriately, is occupied by a cinema showing avant-garde films, and just adjacent to Lathuile was the famous Café Gilbois, which has entered into the mythology of impressionist painting, frequented by Manet and indeed the impressionists to be. And here we see again the work, and top left, in the old days, I used to use slides. I was the last person at COFA to stop using slides, carousel projectors. And then I'd always say, is it focus, out of focus? At least with digital imagery, and I hope you're suitably impressed with the layout of this. You don't worry about focus, it's delightful. Okay, we're looking at a menu top left from Père Lathuile from 1898. And it shows a monocled gentleman, as you can see, all eyes on his female companion across the table, who draws a glass of champagne to her lips. A similar pairing is seen in Manet's Le Père, including the obligatory coup de champagne. But the visual and conceptual dynamics are totally different. Suffice it to say here that the man in the menu leans forward and looks literally down at the woman, quite the reverse of what's happening in the Manet. There's a young man in the pair, of course, and an older woman. She's fashionably dressed, middle class. He's in a casual tunic and a cravat with a moustache and thick black hair. He's a bit of a lad, I think, if his deportment and appearance are anything to go by. I should point out that in 1880, when this work was shown in the Salon and discussed by critics, the sitters, these two figures here, were described variously as, and I quote, two commonplace types, as people, quote, truly in sickening taste. And by Paul Mons, a very important critic writing in Le Temps, he referred to her, the woman, as a badly turned out woman. Belying first impressions, it seems to me that the young man in the painting is squatting, not sitting. I think it's an absolutely critical point, this squatting, but one often overlooked. And I think it sets the tone for the picture's unfolding narratives. To all intents and purposes, the table appears to be set for one. It's difficult to make out the silverware, although the art historian Robert Herbert says that the woman holds, and I quote, a broad-bladed fruit knife in her right hand, and on the plate between her hands is a rounded fruit, end of quote. Perhaps the jury is out on this. A waiter off to our right, holding a coffee urn, keeps a very discreet distance. There are trees, plants, lampposts, and a wonderful dominant green vertical, running from the top of the canvas down and behind the left, our right. Sorry, the right, our left, yes, of the squatting young man. And this feature, this vertical green, was picked up by a critic in 1880, Roger Ballou, who described it as, and I quote, a detail peculiar to Manet's style, a post painted bright green like those seen in newsstands. You see in the boulevards, out-of-doors newsstands. I'll come back to this later, but I'd say here that this reference by Ballou in 1880 to newsstands, I think, is on the money, because it locates Manet's art to some degree at any rate, in popular culture, and I think that's absolutely correct. Occupying the foreground in a pair is a table with a vast tablecloth made up of white, pink, violet, grey tones with hints of corn yellow picked up from the champagne. The tablecloth falls downwards and disappears into the lower margin of the painting. As I've already said, Le Père was shown in the Salon of 1880. The previous year, Manet was represented by in the conservatory we see here and boating. The latter completed 5 years earlier in 1874. He didn't always show things or submit things to the Salon the year they were completed. He could hold them back and then submit them, etc. In the conservatory, the work we see here, like Le Père, this work is about Parisian leisure, urban leisure. We see the Guillemards, good friends of Manet, and owners of a fashionable shop at 19 Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. We see them posing against the backdrop of lush green plants. Madame Guillemet, parasol resting on her legs, sits on a wooden bench. Leaning over is her husband, cigar in hand. Boating, meanwhile, shows Parisians in a zone neither urban or rural, but somewhere in between, an in-between site. However, an in-between site that clearly takes its reference point, as it were, from the city. To put it another way, this image is about a day out, an escape, a bit of quasi-bucolic indulgence on the water. I've spoken briefly about these two works, these two here, right, to make an important point of contrast with Le Père. The women and men in Boating and the conservatory are thoroughly disengaged from each other. This demonstrably visual, but equally important emotional distancing is, as you would know, a very well-known trope in Manet's studies, in Manet's art, and commented upon by many critics and historians, both in Manet's day and certainly in more recent years. Linda Nochlin, T.J. Clark, Robert Herbert, and indeed myself. Yet how exactly Manet treats the individual male and female within these scenarios is another matter. So to help negotiate this, I'd like to draw on the very well-known art critic, art historian Michael Fried, and his equally well-known dualities of theatricality and absorption. Theatricality and absorption. And here, I digress slightly, but I must say that many years ago, I considered Fried highly suspect. And I remember reading what was a hugely contested, albeit a very audacious essay he wrote called Manet's Sources in Art Forum in 1969. I still have the copy. But I now find, I must say, his more recent book, a huge term, you get a coronary from picking it up, his more recent book, Manet's Modernism, or The Face of Painting, in the 1860s, a nice title, a book that I actually reviewed very briefly for the TLS some while ago. I find this far more interesting and persuasive. And he's also, by the way, written recently, I think, a terrific book on Caravaggio, so moving away from his 18th, 19th century French field. So we could say that in the conservatory shows the figures each totally self-absorbed. In other words, the viewer, you and I, in effect, ceases to exist in Fried's terms. By contrast, Boating has a male looking directly at us, albeit with a rather quizzical expression. He is facing us. His is the moment of, as Fried would say, theatricality in the picture. By contrast, his female companion stares fixedly to her front, her gaze running, as it were, if you take that, like, look at her gaze there, okay? Running, as it were, along the surface of the painting. Lips slightly parted. Hers is a look I find unique in Manet's oeuvre. It's that of a mannequin that comes nowhere close to self-absorption, as Fried would understand it, or even reverie. It's a dead stare, I think. Her head, hat, and veil seem totally out of sync with the rest of her body, while her blue and white striped dress is painted in a most spectacular display of pigment simply acting, or pigment simply as painterly signifiers, nothing more, nothing less. I mean, just try and work out the woman's anatomy. It's not possible. So back to Le Père. The two patrons here, contrary to what I've been saying, engage unambiguously with each other. In every sense, they are thoroughly absorbed, but with each other, not in freely in terms of self-absorption. She's looking at him, I'll say more about that, and he is captivated by her. I should add here that there are a few other works by Manet, such as the Masked Ball at the Opera from the early 1870s, in which we can, within this large group of people, we are able to ascertain and identify readable and reasonable interreactions between men and women. But in Manet's treatment of the small gathering, almost without exception, Le Père being a very important one, these interreactions are absent. So they're absent in the canonical Déjeuner sur l'Œuvre from 63, which incidentally Manet didn't exhibit under that nomenclature. He exhibited under the title Le Bain, the bath. Another good example, the balcony, Le Balcon, from 1868. Again, this emotional distancing, the lack of dialogue, connection, physical or otherwise, between the sitters. And it's certainly seen here in the 1874 work, Urgente, and finally in Café Concert, 4 years later, 1878, where no one really seems to engage or to be absorbed in one another. In Le Père, the mutual absorption, if I can put it that way, demonstrated by the two customers, is counterbalanced, going to use a Freudian term, by the theatricality or the facing out of the waiter, who, I should say, contrary to many observations, many writers' comments, does not look at his customers. He doesn't, but he rather looks directly at us, the viewer. He looks at us as we look at him, and at the twosome, who, as I say, seem entirely lost in their own world. And these on the left makes the point. And I have to show you this work over here. I've never seen it. I must go there one day. But an artist called John Seward Johnson Jr. has this great installation of artworks based on old mistresses and old masters that he recreates with ceramics and plaster. So this is a three-dimensional, it's a sculpture in effect, an installation. And I show it to you because John Seward Johnson Jr., let's not forget, actually makes the waiter look directly at the man and the woman. And I've been looking, really going through, Googling Google, I got a bit confused a short while ago, to try and get a back view to see if that guy is indeed squatting. But he clearly must be squatting. It'd be very weird if he is sitting on a chair or whatever there. Okay. The young man in Le Père, there he is there, the bit of a lad, as I've called him, we know who he is. He's Louis Gauthier Lathuile, who is the son of Lathuile Sr., who owned the restaurant. The painting we look at, the Père Lathuile. And here we're looking, by the way, at a small portrait done by a pastel by Manet in 1979. And we can see Gauthier Lathuile, the son, junior, same doe-eyed expression, that we see in the painting we're looking at. We've got a detail on the right. So, we know who the young man in the Père is. It's this person here. And according to Louis Gautier, Manet apparently had said to him, and I quote, "I'll get you to pose together." And the together refers to Louis Gautier Lathuile and an actress who occasionally modeled for Manet, a woman by the name of Hélène André. "I'll get you two to pose together," apparently Manet said. And then apparently Manet continued to say to them, or specifically to Père Lathuile Gautier, you are a military volunteer flirting with a pretty woman. Place yourselves like this and chat with each other while I'm working." How reliable this is, God knows, but still. It then seems that Manet substituted a woman called Judith French, who was a relative of the celebrated Jacques Offenbach, he of opera comique fame. He then substituted Judith French for Hélène André. And in this new setup, i.e. this new model, we learn, or if that's the right word, we are told again from Louis Gautier Lathuile, we are told that Manet apparently said to him, "Take off your tunic, put on my," meaning Manet's jacket. Who knows? But before we leave this little work here, I just point out to you that it's an interesting image because in lots of ways, because we see the back of Père Lathuile Jr., and there seems to be some type of tree here. It's a reflection, right? And then you've got this weird little puff of white, the back of which you see here. And then you begin to think, well, one assumes Manet is really trying to signify a serviette, a napkin. I mean, did Lathuile, is he posing as a waiter, or did he work as a waiter? Who knows? At any rate, this little odd puff of white, this quirky intervention, very typical of Manet. And at the end of the talk, I'll refer to other quirky interventions. But the last thing I'd say about this seemingly modest work is that in interesting ways, for me at any rate, it also points forward to, again, another canonical work by Manet, the Bar at the Folies Bergères, where the whole problematic of reflection or not reflection back front is played out. And I would say that the more I look at Manet's work throughout the entire span of his career, the more I'm convinced that not only does he appropriate or quote from old masters of popular culture, etc., but he also quotes himself. I mean, it's very much an instance of the artist looking at his own work and renegotiating and reissuing, reformulating it. Okay. Now, if the identity of Louis Gautier Lathuile, as we've seen, is clearly not in any doubt, he is the doe-eyed guy in the Père. It seems to me that the identity of the other woman, Hélène André in French, Judith French, I think this is up for grabs. And I would suggest to you that the fashionable women looking down her nose, literally and figuratively, at her squatting younger admirer, is none other than this woman over here. And the woman we're looking at is Manet's close friend, Mademoiselle Isabelle Lemonnier. And here we see her, this gorgeous portrait by Manet from 1780. In other words, done extremely close in time to Le Père. Isabelle Lemonnier, this woman here, by the way, was the sister of Madame Charpentier, who was none other than the wife of the great publisher, Georges Charpentier, who had actually launched the magazine La Vie Moderne. What a better title for Manet than that. La Vie Moderne in 1879, precisely 1 year before Manet presented Le Père Lathuile to the Salon, but the year that Manet actually signed Le Père Lathuile. You might have seen the signature, 1879, right at the beginning, off to the top left of that green slide. So in Manet's portrait of Lemonnier, we see the full portrait here, the angle of the nose, the pert lips, the hairstyle, all this seems to me comes to a head, as it were, in the woman in Le Père. And we see a detail of her here. So I'm now going to refer to this woman, if I may, as Lemonnier. Go for broke, Alan. Lemonnier looks down her nose, as I said, at the young man on the make. Shoulders upright, poised, very much in control of the situation. She is no shrinking violet. I'll return to this point anon. Here, though, if I may, I'd like to draw attention in passing to this huge tablecloth in the Père. It's fascinated me for a while. And I can't help, when looking at this, I can't help but think of similar painterly qualities that appear, for instance, in the great, massive, billowing skirt of Jeanne Duval, on the left there, the Creole mistress of Baudelaire, whom I think it's an extraordinary, engrossing and candid work, the image on the left there. She was very unwell at the time Manet painted this. So look at that dress and the colours and the pigment and the painterly tones and that. Or if we look at this blown-up detail of the balcony, you saw it earlier on, the dress of Bert Morisot and the violinist Fanny Klaus. I didn't identify them before, but it's Morisot, Fanny Klaus, the two women in that work. I mentioned earlier on, right, in fact, early on in the lecture, at the beginning, the introductory part, I refer to Carol Armstrong's book from 2002-3, Manet. And she specifically refers to Manet's dresses. She refers to Manet's white dresses were specifically suited to taking up Baudelaire's challenge of painting La Vie Moderne, of painting modern life. End of quote. In Le Père, I might suggest, the dress has morphed into the tablecloth. And in this process of morphing into the tablecloth, it becomes a metaphor for a new femininity. So let's take a closer look at the woman's lower arms and hands, Limonnier's lower arms and hands. On one level, they simply register, I think you'd agree, as a confusion of pigment and colour. Right, so that's the area there. Mixture of pigment and colour, confusion. Reds, greens, browns, purples, part of the dress, part of what, where does one begin, where does the other end, etc. But as you can see, Lemonnier, the woman, wears fingerless, see-through gloves. And here's an example from the 1830s. Precisely the same type of gloves that Lemonnier wears. I know of no other instance, I repeat, I know of no other instance of fingerless gloves in Manet's oeuvre. But I do know of fingerless gloves in, as you would, in Courbet, Gustave Courbet's scandalous, as it was at the time, Woman alongside the Seine. We see on the left there, and we see a very good detail on the right. This work is from 1856, caused great controversy at the time. So as we can see, the somewhat languorous, reclining woman with a large sun hat, she wears such gloves. And for critics at the time, this was an affront, suggesting that she, and by implication both of them, were neither dressed nor undressed, but certainly immoral. Now, Lemonier's hands, lots happening here, are placed directly in front of her, flat on the tablecloth. For me, they are visualized in ways that border on the reptilian. I would go so far as to say they are lobster-like. I look at that scaly surface. And I had concluded this much when, perfectly unexpectedly, I very, very, very recently, how many berries was that, came across that image on the bottom right there. It's not the best of images, but you can make it out. And it was a cartoon by someone going under the pseudonym Nidrac, Nidrac, published for the Parisian magazine Salon Comique of 1880. All right. And it shows, it's a reference, of course, to the painting we're looking at. But here, the hands, arms, hands, are translated completely, unequivocally, into these lobster pincers. You can make out, right? And then you've got that big hand of the man, trying to invade her space, pull her towards him. So clearly, in the eyes of the cartoonists, and again, my students would know from the course I teach on the painting of modern life, that certainly in the context of the latter half of the 19th century in Paris, cartoons and caricatures which absolutely proliferated in ephemeral magazines, in popular magazines, in tabloids, newspapers, was a very serious form of art criticism, as it were, the cartoon, the caricature. Now, I think these are very revealing, because there are things that the cartoonists, it seems to me, can articulate that the so-called serious critic cannot. And I think we've got a good instance of this here. So clearly, here the cartoonist turns Manet's seated woman into, if you like, a type of vagina dentata. She is clearly seen as a threat to the man. Now, the narratives I'm setting up here, folks, of course, go beyond the material specifics of gloves and hands. They really segue, it seems to me, into larger mid-19th century questions to do with bourgeois leisure, sexuality, looking and being looked at, demeanor, and delivery. Take, for example, in 1841, a study came out on the physiology of the glove, in which the writer observes, and I quote, "The glove, this divine and powerful intermediary, exposes deceits and reveals truth." Divine and powerful, it exposes deceits and reveals truth. Or another text from the 1840s called La Vie Élégante à Paris, Elegant Paris. And the writer says, leaving the theatre, a concert, or the opera, you should avoid touching her referred to a woman of high rank, her bare skin. You should avoid touching her bare skin. A woman's hand, and especially that of a young woman, may not be held in yours for more than a fleeting moment. Take note. May not be held in yours for more than a fleeting moment. So if gloves concealed and revealed, and if we take into account these comments I've just thrown out to you from these two texts, then the transparent fingerless gloves worn by Lemonnier, who a cartoonist turns her hands into pincers, lobster pincers, these hands, arms, gloves, fingerless gloves, raise all sorts of troubling questions, as indeed does the glass of champagne, which you can see very clearly guarded by the squatting man. There's a bottle of champagne, also often overlooked, in an ice bucket. You see it over there? Cropped by the left margin of the painting. A full bottle for a single woman, no partner, no chaperone. Did the young man bring the glass of champagne to the table as part of his, as it were, introduction? Or as the very fine feminist art historian Kathleen Adler, someone I know well in London, suggests, has he, the squatter, appropriated the woman's? Or might, just might, there be someone seated to the far left of the painting? I don't know. By implication, Lemonnier's male, female companion, out of sight, out of mind, out of our sight, out of our mind, I don't know. As I pointed out and stressed at the beginning of the lecture, Manet chose to qualify his paintings with the words en plein air. And of one thing I'm absolutely sure, Manet never ever used titles gratuitously. Now, the phrase en plein air in a painting, a title, is unique. It's unique in Manet's oeuvre. And it takes us in the direction of course, what? Impressionism. The summary technique of what I would call core impressionists, a technique which was seen as synonymous with the sketch, with en plein air, painting out of doors, in situ. This type of technique is clearly evident in Lathuile, as indeed is this technique, but taken to a far greater extreme, seen in this little earlier work, Swallows, a painting, incidentally, that Manet submitted to the Salon in 1874, but it was rejected. And 1874, again, en passant, 1874, that was a year the Impressionists to be held their first group exhibition. So the trope of the loose brushwork equals impressionism, equals lack of artistic discipline, right? Loose brushwork equals impressionism, equals lack of artistic discipline, appears in other works by Manet. Certainly in Bottine, which we looked at, accepted in the Salon of 1879, and in this bizarre, it's a work that really needs far more research, this bizarre but intriguing portrait by Manet, shown in the 1881 Salon, portrait of the celebrated line hunter, Pertuiset, weird image. So the big question is, why does Manet insist on saying that Chez le Père Lathuile was executed en plein air? One answer, it seems to me, may lie in the fact that in 1880, there was a significant shift in what I might call the aesthetic air du temps. It's a lovely French phrase, air du temps. The prevailing cultural mores, what's in the air. And 1880, there were some significant shifts. My dear friend and colleague Faye Brower has written on this very tellingly. So, to give you an example, in 1880, in response to huge protests by artists, the arts undersecretary in Paris, a certain Edmond Turquet, who was then caricatured as a turkey, it's spelled Turquet, Edmond Turquet. The arts undersecretary introduced significant changes to the constitution of the Paris Salon. Most importantly, all artists who had exhibited in 3 salons were actually now allowed to vote. And this was, of course, in addition to the customary academicians, etc., etc. So, in summary, we have, in 1880, and around about this time, what has been seen as the liberalization of the salon. And interestingly, even in 1880, the year this work was in the salon, it appears that the salon jury, because he had a jury that accepted works, decided who came, who didn't, couldn't be accepted, how works would be hung, who should get a medal, who didn't. The chair was none other than the hugely conservative Bouguereau, and apparently he even considered awarding a medal to Manet in 1880. The fact of the matter, though, is this. You have the shift in the cultural climate, the aesthetic climate at this time. And I think Manet was very aware of it. And Manet's exhibition strategies are in themselves very telling. He's very canny. And it seems to me that by calling or subtitling this en plein air, and by including in the work these gestures that are redolent of the typical, quote-unquote, impressionist gesture, that Manet was playing to this audience. And again, if one looks at the criticism, the more extensive criticism of this work and other works at this time, which was 6 years, right? 6 years since the first group Impressionist show, 1874. The painterly signifier, the loose brush mark, a child of 6 could do it type thing, was already being ensconced and accepted in the popular and critical imagination. Okay, 10 to 7, and I'm about to conclude. I'd like to say a few words, if I may, finally, about the seen but the overlooked in the Père. The blue and white pigment at the top left of the picture, right, is surely meant to represent the back of a waiter. You see a terrific detail here. Leaning slightly forwards, looking at a detail, which we see here, I'm absolutely amazed by the cryptic nature of this painterly notation. That's what it is. It's a painterly notation. And slightly to our left of the waiter, of the squatting man, sorry, as you were, slightly to our left of this waiter here, right, we see this. You with me? And they can best be described as what? Well, 2 lines of white and grey. There and there, okay? If you can make out this little, right there and there. They go all the way from the top of the canvas and then seem to disappear, right, behind these 2, the foliage, the plants, and the 2 red flowers. Now, these dripping lines, and again we see them here, can only be described as, well, what? Literally, well, as dripping water. Now, At first I thought they were falling down the surface of what I see as a glass partition, and I still think it is.
I think it's a reflection of the green post.
Sorry?
I think it's a reflection of the green post.
Well, I didn't ask you, Sol. We'll come back to this in question and answer. Okay, let me finish. So at first I thought they were falling down the surface of the glass. But as a colleague and a friend of mine, John Murphy, who does some teaching here, rightly pointed out, is John here by any chance? If so, thank you, John. If not, never mind. This reading does not sit easily with the visual signs, because the two streams of pigment or water, as you can see here, fall over the brown yellow structure of the building, and importantly, they fall in front, right, in front of the awning, in front of the greyish slanted awning. A closer look shows that one of the streams of pigment water actually falls in front of the table over which the waiter bends, while the other falls behind it. Indeed, the trajectory of water to our left is painted directly over in front of that indeterminate red shape on over there, right? That red, which I would, you can see it goes over it, it's at the back, which I would suggest is none other than a bowl of red flowers on the table, flowers like those seen elsewhere in the painting. Okay, now, Sol's point. This is the first time I've given this lecture in Australia. It's the second time I've given it in public. I gave a slightly different version in Bristol, my university, where I did my PhD, as I said, when I was there in England, London, at the beginning of this year, for that exhibition in which this work did not appear. And someone then, like evidently someone here is going to suggest, or has suggested, they said, well, don't the two lines of pigment water represent the trajectory of a fountain, rising and falling? Now, it's odd, I never even considered this, and indeed it's a tantalizing thought. Now, seeing the painting in the flesh, which I have not, I might add, may sort this out. Knowing more about the restaurant Père Lathuile in its late 19th century context may solve the problem, if indeed it is a problem. Did it have an outdoor fountain? However, it still seems to me that one way or t'other, however you read these lines, these drippings, they intrigue. So what do we make of them? On one level, going back to what I said early on, they force the painting, to use Freudian terms, to face us, to look at us. Just as Manet does with the waiter looking at us, and indeed that green cropped vertical. These are the things that are all about facing out, it seems to me. More importantly, however, I'd suggest that the conceit of the drippings, and they are a conceit, I think, just like the conceit of the summarily painted frog, Mr. Frog there, at the bottom left of the Déjeuner célèbre, or the conceit of that weird blotch of pigment, rightly noted by Michael Fried, on the right foot of Christ. Or, for example, that piece of rope that hangs from the folded mast in Argenté, which you saw earlier on, which, as T.J. Clark has correctly observed, cunningly suggests the reflection of the chimney stack on the far bank. So it seems to me that all these gestures, all these conceits, are Manet's wholehearted embrace of, on the one hand, the guile of the artist, and on the other hand, the sleight of nature, or the sleight of hand nature of painting. And by way of an exceedingly short postscript, 4 lines, the art critic for Time magazine, a certain Richard Lacayo, L-A-C-A-Y-O, recently wrote, and I quote, he said, "Art lies," and he meant as deception, not as in laying down. Art lies, he said. That's one of the things it does best. And if it does it right, it points to some kind of truth every time. Thank you very much.